Single dad janitor makes bubbles to calm a girl in crisis, unaware her CEO mom was watching. Hit like and subscribe so we can keep creating the stories you love. The scream pierced through the marble-walled lobby of Meridian Media Tower like a siren, causing every Armani-suited executive to freeze mid-stride. It wasn't just any scream. It was the kind of raw, desperate wail that comes from a child's soul breaking apart. 7-year-old Evie Lane lay curled on the polished floor, her small body trembling as sobs racked through her. Her perfectly pressed school uniform was wrinkled, her blonde hair a tangled mess around her tear-stained face. She rocked back and forth, arms wrapped so tightly around her knees that her knuckles had turned white. "Mommy, mommy, mommy," she whispered between gasps, the word becoming a broken mantra. The lobby, usually a symphony of clicking heels, hushed phone calls, and the gentle hum of commerce, had gone eerily silent. A circle of uncomfortable onlookers had formed, their faces a mixture of concern and helplessness. The receptionist, Sarah, stood frozen behind her mahogany desk, phone receiver halfway to her ear. Should I call someone?" Sarah whispered to no one in particular. James, the head of security, shifted awkwardly in his polished shoes. He'd handled corporate espionage, angry protesters, even a bomb threat once. But a crying child? This was uncharted territory. "Ma'am," he said softly, crouching down. "Are you hurt? Where's your mommy?" Evie's response was to curl tighter into herself, her sobs growing more desperate. The sound echoed off the marble walls like a haunting melody of pure anguish. That's when Ben Carter appeared. He'd been mopping the far corridor when he heard the commotion. At 42, Ben had the kind of weathered face that spoke of sleepless nights and hard choices. His janitor's uniform was spotless but worn, his hands calloused from years of honest work. He pushed his cart aside and walked toward the crowd, his sneakers silent on the marble floor. "Excuse me," he said quietly, gently moving through the circle of executives. Several people turned to look at him with barely concealed annoyance. A janitor interrupting their crisis management? But Ben ignored their stares. He'd seen that look before, the look that said he was invisible, irrelevant, just part of the building's infrastructure. Ben knelt down beside Evie, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't touch her or speak. Instead, he reached into his cleaning cart and pulled out a small bottle of dish soap and a bent coat hanger he'd fashioned into a bubble wand weeks ago for his own son during a particularly difficult day. The executives watched in bewilderment as Ben dipped the makeshift wand into the soapy solution. With practiced ease, he began to blow. One perfect bubble floated into the air, then another, and another. The bubbles caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, transforming into tiny rainbows that danced above Evie's head. They moved with an almost magical quality, defying gravity for just a moment before disappearing with the softest whisper. Evie's sobs began to quiet. Her red-rimmed eyes tracked the bubble's lazy journey across the lobby. One landed on her shoe and popped silently. She blinked, fascinated. Ben continued his gentle magic, saying nothing, just creating these small spheres of wonder. His movements were calm, meditative, like a man who understood that sometimes healing came not in grand gestures, but in tiny moments of beauty. "Pretty," Evie whispered, so softly that only Ben heard her. The word hung in the air like one of his bubbles, fragile, precious, and gone too soon. What none of them knew, not Ben, not the executives, not even little Evie, was that 30 feet above them, standing at the glass railing of the second-floor balcony, Margot Lane was watching everything unfold. Margot had been in the middle of the most brutal board meeting of her career when her assistant, Patricia, had burst through the conference room doors, something that simply never happened. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Lane, but there's a situation downstairs with Evie." The words had hit Margot like ice water. She'd raced from the boardroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. Emergency scenarios flashed through her mind. Injury, kidnapping, worse. As the CEO of one of the most powerful media companies in the country, she'd made enemies. Had someone targeted her daughter? But when she reached the balcony overlooking the lobby, she found something she hadn't expected. Her daughter, calm for the first time in months, watching bubbles with a man she didn't recognize. Margot gripped the glass railing, her manicured nails clicking against the surface. Below, Ben continued his quiet magic show. He had infinite patience, this stranger, as if he had all the time in the world for one little girl's crisis. Who was he? And why did her daughter, who hadn't responded to 3 different therapists, a child psychiatrist, and countless expensive interventions, seemed so peaceful in his presence. As Margot watched, Ben caught Evie's eye and smiled. It wasn't the practiced smile of someone trying to manage a situation. It was genuine, warm, the kind of smile that said, "I see you, and you matter." Evie smiled back. It was the first real smile Margot had seen on her daughter's face since the accident 6 months ago. 3 days passed before Margot could shake the image of the janitor with the bubbles from her mind. She'd tried to focus on quarterly reports, merger negotiations, the endless demands of running a media empire. But during quiet moments, between phone calls, in the elevator, lying awake at 3 a.m., she kept seeing that gentle man sitting cross-legged on her lobby floor. More importantly, she kept hearing Evie's voice. "Mommy, when can I see the bubble man again?" It was Thursday morning when Margot made her decision. She called down to Human Resources. "Patricia, I need information on one of our janitorial staff. A man, early 40s maybe, works the day shift. Any particular reason, Miss Lane?" Margot hesitated. How did she explain that this man had accomplished in 5 minutes what months of expensive therapy had failed to do? That her daughter had actually asked to come to work with her yesterday, something that hadn't happened since before the accident? "Company security review," she said instead. It wasn't entirely a lie. 2 hours later, Patricia knocked on Margot's corner office door, carrying a thin manila folder. "Ben Carter," Patricia said, settling into the leather chair across from Margot's massive desk. 42 years old. Widower. He's worked here for 3 years. Excellent reviews from maintenance staff. Never missed a day, never had a complaint filed against him. Margot opened the folder, scanning the sparse contents. Employment application, background check, a few performance reviews. The details painted a picture of someone utterly ordinary and completely reliable. He has a son, Patricia continued, 12 years old, listed as his emergency contact and dependent. What happened to his wife? That's not in his employment file, but Patricia hesitated. "I may have done a little extra research." Margot raised an eyebrow. Patricia had been her assistant for 8 years and knew how to read between the lines. "Cancer," Patricia said softly. 3.5 years ago. She was a nurse at Children's Hospital. There were some local news articles about fundraisers the hospital staff organized for the family. Margot felt something twist in her chest. She knew about loss, about the way it could reshape a person's entire world. Her own husband had died in a helicopter crash when Evie was barely 2. But at least she'd had money, resources, options. This man had lost his wife and kept working, kept going, kept showing up. "There's something else," Patricia said. Before his wife got sick, he was a music teacher. Elementary school. Had to quit to care for her, and then, well, the medical bills. The pieces were starting to form a picture. A music teacher would understand patience, would know how to connect with children. A man who'd lost everything would understand desperation, fear, the feeling of the world spinning out of control. "His son," Margot said. "What do you know about him?" Patricia flipped a page. "David Carter. Special needs, autism spectrum. Ben's listed as his primary caregiver. They live in Riverside Heights." Margot knew the neighborhood. Working-class families, small apartments. The kind of place where people looked out for each other because they had to. It was a 45-minute bus ride from the gleaming towers of downtown, where she lived and worked. "I want to meet him," Margot said suddenly. Patricia blinked. "Ben Carter? Ms. Lane, I should mention that any direct contact with employees regarding non-performance issues should probably go through." "Not as his boss," Margot interrupted. "As Evie's mother." That afternoon, Margot found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, riding the elevator down to the basement level of her own building. The maintenance department was a maze of service corridors and storage rooms that smelled of cleaning supplies and machine oil. It was a world that existed parallel to her penthouse office, invisible but essential. She found Ben in the supply room, methodically checking inventory on a clipboard. He looked up when she entered, and she saw a flash of surprise followed quickly by concern. "Ms. Lane, is everything all right?" His voice was exactly as she remembered from watching him with Evie, calm, steady, genuinely concerned. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, like someone accustomed to staying in the background. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for what you did for my daughter on Monday." Ben set down his clipboard. Evie? Is she okay? I was worried when I didn't see her again. The fact that he remembered her name, that he'd been thinking about her, hit Margot unexpectedly. When was the last time someone had asked about Evie not because they had to, but because they cared? She's been asking about you. About the bubble man. Ben smiled, and Margot saw exactly what Evie had seen. Warmth, kindness, the complete absence of judgment. She's a special little girl, he said. Reminded me of my son when he was younger. Sometimes the world gets too loud, you know? Sometimes you just need something quiet and beautiful to focus on. Your son, David. He's 12 now, but when he was Evie's age, he used to have what we call big feeling days. Days when everything was just too much. His mom used to sing to him, but after Ben paused, clearing his throat. Well, I had to find other ways to help him through the storms. Margot felt that twist in her chest again. Here was a man who understood, who'd walked the same impossible path of loving a child who was struggling and not knowing how to fix it. The bubbles, she said. Discovered them by accident, actually. I was cleaning David's room one day, and he was having a meltdown about his routine being disrupted. I was mixing cleaning solution, and some bubbles formed. He stopped crying and just watched them, like they were the most amazing things he'd ever seen. Ben picked up a spray bottle from the shelf, demonstrating. Turns out there's something about bubbles, the way they move, the way they catch the light, how they're there 1 second and gone the next. David calls them temporary magic. Temporary magic. Margot filed that phrase away, knowing she'd never forget it. Would you? She began, then stopped. What was she asking? For him to fix her daughter? To be some kind of miracle worker? But Ben seemed to understand. If it would help Evie, I'd be happy to show her more bubble tricks. Maybe she and David could meet sometime. He's good with younger kids, and he understands what it's like when the world feels scary. The offer was so simple, so generous, that Margot felt tears threaten. When was the last time someone had offered to help without wanting something in return? That's very kind of you, Mr. Carter. Ben, he corrected gently. And it's not kind. It's just, when you've been where I've been, you recognize the signs. Evie's carrying something heavy. I know that look. As Margot rode the elevator back to her office, she realized that for the first time in months, she felt something that had been missing from her life. Hope. But she also felt something else, something that would change everything. The terrible recognition that while she'd been building an empire, she'd somehow lost sight of what actually mattered. The family event was supposed to be simple, Meridian Media's annual Bring Your Family to Work Day. Margot had instituted it 3 years ago as part of the company's culture initiative, a way to humanize the corporate environment and show employees that work-life balance mattered. This year, she had an ulterior motive. You're sure you want to bring David? Ben asked as they stood in the lobby that Friday afternoon. He was dressed in his best clothes, a navy button-down shirt and khakis that were clearly reserved for special occasions. His son David stood beside him, fidgeting with a small toy car, his eyes fixed on the marble patterns on the floor. Mom said there would be other kids, David said without looking up. And food that isn't cafeteria food. Ben smiled and ruffled his son's hair. She did promise pizza. Margot approached them, Evie's small hand clutched tightly in hers. Her daughter had been excited about the event all week, but now, faced with the lobby full of families and noise, she'd gone quiet again. Ben, Margot said, and she was surprised by how relieved she felt to see him. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting us. This is my son, David. David, this is Ms. Lane. David glanced up briefly, gave a small wave, then returned his attention to his toy car. Margot recognized the behavior. She'd seen it in some of Evie's classmates. Direct eye contact was difficult. Social situations were overwhelming. And you must be Evie, David said suddenly, crouching down to her level. Dad told me you like bubbles too. Evie nodded but didn't speak. I brought something, David continued, pulling a small bottle from his pocket. Dad taught me how to make the really good bubble solution. Wanna see? For the next hour, Margot watched as David and Ben worked together to draw Evie out of her shell. They set up a small bubble station in a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the main crowd. David explained the science behind different bubble solutions while Ben demonstrated techniques for making bubbles of different sizes. The secret, David told Evie seriously, is the glycerin. It makes the bubble walls stronger so they don't pop as fast. Dad learned that from YouTube. Evie actually giggled, when Ben created a bubble the size of a dinner plate. How do you do that? She whispered. Very carefully, Ben said, showing her how to move the wand slowly through the air. And with patience. The biggest bubbles need time to form. Margot stood watching from across the room, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. She'd hired child development specialists, enrolled Evie in art therapy, even considered taking time off work to focus on her daughter's healing. But here, in the span of an hour, Ben and David had accomplished what months of professional intervention hadn't managed. They'd made Evie laugh. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. The event had moved to the company's main conference room, where families were seated around tables, eating pizza and listening to presentations about different departments. Evie had been doing well, staying close to David and whispering to him occasionally. But then someone's phone rang, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the conversation. The sound was followed by the screech of tires from the street outside. Evie froze. Her face went white, and Margot recognized the signs immediately. Evie's breathing became shallow. Her hands started to shake. The sounds, so ordinary to everyone else, had triggered something deep and terrifying. Evie, Margot said, moving toward her daughter. But Evie was already retreating into herself, that familiar look of panic spreading across her features. The room continued its cheerful buzz, unaware of the crisis unfolding in the corner. Margot knelt beside her daughter, her own heart racing. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. Mommy's here. But Evie wasn't hearing her. She was somewhere else, somewhere that smelled like burning rubber and twisted metal, somewhere that had stolen her voice 6 months ago. That's when Ben appeared beside them, David right behind him. Hey, Evie, Ben said softly, not touching her but positioning himself where she could see him. Remember what we learned about bubbles today? Evie's eyes found his, wide and terrified. David taught you about the glycerin, right? How it makes them stronger. Ben was already pulling out the bubble solution, his movements calm and deliberate. But you know what makes bubbles really special? He dipped the wand and blew gently. A single perfect bubble floated between them. They're brave, Ben continued. Think about it. They're so fragile, but they float out into the world anyway. They don't know how long they'll last, but they're beautiful for as long as they can be. Another bubble, then another. Even when they pop, David added, understanding immediately what his father was doing, they don't really disappear. They just change. The soap goes back to being soap, and the air goes back to being air, and everything's still there. Just different. Evie's breathing began to slow. Her eyes tracked the bubbles floating around them, each one catching the conference room lights like tiny planets. I used to be scared of popping sounds too, David said quietly. Balloons, cars backfiring, even bubble wrap. Dad taught me that sounds can't hurt you. They're just temporary noise. Ben blew a larger bubble, and it floated directly toward Evie. Instead of popping when it touched her arm, it clung there for a moment, a perfect sphere reflecting her face back at her. Don't let the bubbles pop, Evie whispered. The words were so soft that Margot almost didn't catch them. But Ben heard. He smiled and created more bubbles, filling the space around them with floating magic. I won't, he promised. Not unless you want them to. For the next several minutes, Ben maintained a steady stream of bubbles while David explained their physics and Margot held her breath. The conference room continued its activities around them, but their little corner had become a sanctuary. Then something miraculous happened. Don't let the bubbles pop, Evie said again, but louder this time. Loud enough that several nearby families turned to look. She was speaking. In public. With people listening. The room gradually fell quiet as more people noticed. Evie, realizing she had an audience, looked around with wonder rather than fear. I can make bubbles too, she announced, reaching for the wand. The entire room burst into applause. Margot felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter, her brave, broken, beautiful daughter, blow bubbles for a room full of strangers. Each sphere that floated away carried with it months of silence and fear. Later, as families were saying their goodbyes, Margot pulled Ben aside. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Ben looked across the room to where David and Evie were showing other children how to make bubble solution. You don't need to thank me, Margot. This is what people do for each other. But Margot knew it wasn't that simple. What Ben had done, what he continued to do, was extraordinary. He'd seen a child in crisis and responded not with professional distance or awkward sympathy, but with genuine understanding and creative compassion. "I want to offer you something," she said. "A position. A real position, not just a thank you gesture." Ben looked surprised. "Margot, you don't need to." "Not charity," she interrupted. "I'm thinking about starting a program. Something for families dealing with trauma, with children who need different approaches. You have a gift, Ben, and this company has resources." Ben was quiet for a long moment, watching the children. "What kind of program?" "I don't know yet. That's what I want to figure out with you. Something that recognizes that healing doesn't always happen in therapy offices or through traditional methods. Sometimes it happens with bubbles in a corporate lobby." As Ben considered her offer, Margot realized that this conversation would change both their lives. But she also knew, with sudden clarity, that change was exactly what they all needed. The question was, would Ben be willing to trust her with his gift? Ben didn't sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed in the two-bedroom apartment he shared with David, staring at the ceiling and replaying Margot's offer in his mind. Through the thin walls, he could hear David talking quietly to himself, a self-soothing habit that helped him process the day's experiences. A program for families dealing with trauma, a real position, not just pushing a mop through corporate hallways. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything. Better pay, health insurance that might actually cover David's therapy sessions, maybe even the chance to move to a better neighborhood. It was also terrifying. Ben rolled over and looked at the photo on his nightstand. Him, David, and Sarah at David's 8th birthday, back when life still made sense. Sarah was laughing at something David had said. Her nurse's uniform rumpled from a long shift, but her eyes bright with love. She believed in possibilities, in second chances, in the idea that good things could happen to people who deserve them. "What would you do, sweetheart?" he whispered to the photo. But he already knew the answer. Sarah had never been afraid of taking chances, especially when it meant helping people. She'd become a pediatric nurse because she wanted to make scary hospital stays a little less frightening for children. She would have loved what happened in that conference room, would have understood immediately why Margot's offer mattered. The next morning, Ben found David in the kitchen, methodically arranging cereal pieces in perfect rows before eating them. "Big feelings day?" Ben asked gently. David nodded without looking up. "The event yesterday was good, but it was also a lot. Evie was nice, though. She understood about bubble science." Ben poured himself coffee and sat down across from his son. "David, what would you think if I told you I might get a different job?" This got David's attention. He looked up from his cereal, concern flickering across his features. "Different how? Are you going to stop being the bubble man?" The question caught Ben off guard. "The bubble man? That's what Evie called you yesterday. She told her mom that the bubble man makes everything feel safer." David paused, considering. "I like that you're the bubble man. It makes me proud." Ben felt something warm expand in his chest. It would still involve bubbles and helping kids, but it would be bigger, more official. Would we have to move? Maybe, eventually, to somewhere nicer. David processed this information, his face serious. Would there be more kids like me and Evie? Kids who need bubble science? Probably. "Then you should do it," David said simply. "Mom used to say that when you have a gift, you're supposed to share it. Your gift is making scared kids feel better." Later that morning, Ben called Margot's office. "I'd like to take you up on your offer," he told her. "But I have some conditions." They met that afternoon in a coffee shop near the building, neutral territory, away from the corporate atmosphere that still made Ben feel like he was crossing invisible boundaries. "First," Ben said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "I need to understand exactly what you're proposing. I won't be a token hire, someone you parade around to make the company look good." Margot nodded. "That's not what I want either. I've been thinking about this since yesterday, doing some research. Do you know how many children in this city are dealing with trauma? Divorce, loss, abuse, medical issues, family upheaval? The traditional therapy model works for some kids, but others need something different." She pulled out a tablet and showed him articles she'd bookmarked. Art therapy, music therapy, animal-assisted intervention. There are dozens of approaches that complement traditional counseling. But they're expensive, hard to access, not covered by most insurance plans. And you want to change that? "I want to create a comprehensive program that families can access regardless of their financial situation. A place where children and parents can find the kind of help they actually need, not just what the system thinks they should need. Ben studied her face, looking for signs that this was corporate idealism, a wealthy woman's guilt project that would lose funding the moment it stopped generating good publicity. But what he saw was genuine passion, the kind of focused intensity that had probably made her successful in business. Why me? He asked. You could hire credentialed therapists, people with degrees and certifications. Because credentials don't create magic, Margot said simply. What you did for Evie, what you do for David, that comes from understanding, from experience, from having walked the path yourself. I want to build a team of people who get it, who've lived it. She leaned forward, her voice gaining urgency. I've been reading about trauma-informed care, about how traditional therapy sometimes re-traumatizes children by forcing them to talk about things they're not ready to discuss. But you created a safe space for Evie without asking her to say a single word about the accident. You met her where she was. My second condition, Ben said, is that David has to be part of this somehow. I won't take a job that requires me to be away from him more than I already am. Actually, I was hoping you'd say that. I think David could be an incredible peer mentor for other kids on the spectrum. He has insights that adults don't have, and yesterday I watched him connect with Evie in ways that professional therapists haven't been able to manage. Ben felt a surge of pride. David had always been his greatest teacher, showing him daily how to find beauty in routine, how to appreciate the small details that most people overlooked, how to be patient with processes that couldn't be rushed. Third condition, Ben continued. I want to be involved in hiring decisions. If we're building a team, I need to work with people who understand that healing isn't always linear, that progress sometimes looks like regression, that some of the most important breakthroughs happen in moments that don't look like therapy at all. Agreed. What else? Ben hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. I need time to transition. I can't just abandon my current responsibilities without proper notice. And I need to make sure this is sustainable for the program, for the families we'll serve, and for my own family. Margot smiled. That's exactly the kind of careful thinking I want in a program director. Program director? That's the title I had in mind. Director of Family Wellness Innovation. It sounds corporate, but it gives you the authority to make real decisions about how the program develops. Ben sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. 6 months ago, he'd been a widowed janitor struggling to keep his head above water, measuring success by whether he and David made it through each day intact. Now he was being offered the chance to create something that could help hundreds of families. There's one more thing, Margot said quietly. I want you to know that this isn't charity, and it's not guilt. Yesterday, watching Evie speak for the first time in months, seeing her laugh and play and be a child again, that was the most important thing that's happened in my professional life. You gave me my daughter back, Ben. Let me give you the resources to do that for other families. As Ben walked home that evening, David's hand in his, he realized that everything was about to change. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely uncertain. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was moving towards something rather than just trying to survive. Dad, David said as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Are you scared about the new job? Ben considered the question. Yeah, buddy, I am. But sometimes the best things are a little scary, you know? David nodded seriously. Like when bubbles get really big. They're more beautiful, but they're also more fragile. Exactly like that. That night, Ben called his sister in Portland to tell her about the offer. Ben, that's incredible, she said. Sarah would be so proud. You think so? I know so. She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever met. Now you get to show the world what she saw. After he hung up, Ben sat in his living room, looking around at the small space that had been home for 3 years. It wasn't much, secondhand furniture, walls that needed painting, a kitchen table where David did homework every night. But it had been their sanctuary after Sarah died, the place where they'd learned how to be a family of two. Soon, they'd move to something bigger, somewhere with more space for David to grow and explore. The thought filled Ben with a mixture of excitement and melancholy. But change, he was learning, didn't always mean loss. Sometimes it meant the chance to honor what you'd been through by helping others through similar struggles. Sometimes it meant turning survival into service, trauma into teaching, grief into grace. Tomorrow, He would give Meridian Media his notice as a janitor and accept the position as Director of Family Wellness Innovation. It was a title that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, but Ben was beginning to understand that impossible things happen more often than people realized. They just usually started with something as simple as bubbles floating in a corporate lobby, catching the light, and making one scared little girl remember that the world could still be beautiful. 6 weeks later, Ben stood in what used to be an unused conference room on the third floor of Meridian Media Tower, watching as contractors put finishing touches on what would become the flagship location of the Family Wellness Innovation Center. The space looked nothing like a corporate conference room anymore. Gone were the intimidating mahogany table and leather chairs. In their place were soft reading nooks, art stations, a sensory corner with weighted blankets and noise-canceling headphones, and yes, a dedicated bubble laboratory that David had helped design. "The lighting is perfect in here," said Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the trauma specialist Margot had hired as the program's clinical director. Elena was everything Ben had hoped for in a colleague: brilliant but humble, credentialed but practical, someone who understood that healing happened in relationship, not just in technique. David insisted on the windows, Ben said, watching his son demonstrate the bubble station to Evie, who had become a regular visitor during the setup process. He said natural light makes the bubbles more magical. Smart kid. How's he adjusting to all the changes? Ben smiled as he watched David patiently show Evie how to adjust the wand angle for different bubble sizes. Better than I am, honestly. He keeps reminding me that change doesn't have to mean loss. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of planning, hiring, and training. Ben had recruited Maria Santos, a former teacher who'd left education after her own daughter's suicide attempt, to head their peer support program. They'd hired James Wright, a veteran who'd found healing through art therapy after his deployment, to run creative workshops. Dr. Rodriguez brought years of experience with trauma-informed care and a refreshing lack of ego about alternative healing methods. "Mr. Ben." Evie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She'd started calling him that on her second visit, and it had stuck. "Can you show the new people the giant bubble trick?" The new people were their first official family, the Hendersons, whose 8-year-old son Marcus had been struggling with anxiety since his parents' divorce. They were scheduled for an intake session, but Evie had convinced her mother to come early so she could help explain about bubbles. Ben looked at Marcus, who was clinging to his mother's hand and eyeing the room with obvious suspicion. Classic signs: hypervigilance, reluctance to engage, the ready-to-run posture Ben recognized from his own early days with David. "I don't know," Ben said thoughtfully. "Giant bubbles are pretty advanced. Think Marcus is ready for that level of bubble science." It was a calculated gamble, offering a challenge instead of pressure. Marcus straightened slightly. "I'm good at science," he said quietly. "Oh, really? Well, in that case." Ben began preparing the special solution for larger bubbles, explaining each step as he went. "The key is patience. You can't rush a giant bubble. You have to move the wand very slowly, like this." David joined him, adding his own observations about surface tension and glycerin ratios. Within minutes, Marcus had forgotten to be anxious, too caught up in the fascinating process of creating soap film strong enough to hold air in increasingly large spheres. Ben caught Mrs. Henderson's eye and saw tears there. Later, she would tell him that it was the first time in 6 months that Marcus had shown interest in anything besides hiding in his room. "How do you do that?" Dr. Rodriguez asked him quietly as Marcus successfully created his first dinner plate-sized bubble. "Do what? Make it look so effortless. I've been working with traumatized children for 15 years, and I still struggle to get some of them to engage." Ben considered the question. "I think it's because I'm not trying to fix them. I'm just trying to be present with them where they are. The bubbles aren't therapy, they're just bubbles. But sometimes when you give someone something beautiful to focus on, they forget to be afraid long enough to remember who they are underneath the trauma." Over the following weeks, the program began to take shape. Families arrived carrying invisible burdens: divorce, death, diagnosis, displacement, and found something unexpected: a place where their pain was acknowledged without being dissected, where their children could heal at their own pace. There was 7-year-old Sophia, whose selective mutism had developed after witnessing domestic violence, who communicated through art for 3 months before saying her first word during a bubble painting session. There was 12-year-old Jamal, whose anger issues stemmed from his father's imprisonment, who found peace in the methodical process of mixing bubble solutions with perfect pH balance. Each success story taught Ben something new about resilience, about the countless ways children could find healing when given the right environment and enough time. But it was Mrs. Chin's visit that would change everything. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon without an appointment, her 5-year-old daughter Lily hiding behind her legs. Ben was in the main room, working with David to set up new sensory equipment, when Maria brought them over. Mrs. Chin saw our program featured in that article last week, Maria explained quietly. She's been calling different organizations for months, trying to find help for Lily. Ben knelt down to Lily's eye level, but kept his distance. She was tiny even for 5, with huge dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "Hi, Lily," he said softly. "I'm Ben. This is my son David. We like to play with bubbles here. Want to see?" Lily shook her head and pressed closer to her mother. Mrs. Chin's voice was barely above a whisper. "She hasn't spoken since the fire. 3 months ago. We lost everything. Our apartment, her toys, her books. She was trapped in her room for almost 10 minutes before the firefighters got to her." Ben felt his chest tighten. Fire trauma was particularly challenging because it engaged so many senses: the sight of flames, the sound of sirens, the smell of smoke, the feeling of heat and helplessness. "Has she been working with anyone?" he asked gently. "2 different therapists. They keep saying she needs to process the trauma, that she has to talk about what happened. But every time someone tries to make her discuss it, she just disappears more." Ben glanced at David, who was listening intently. His son had an uncanny ability to read situations and often provided insights that adults missed. "Dad," David said quietly, "remember what you told me about Mom's last day? How talking about scary things sometimes makes them scarier." Ben nodded. After Sarah died, well-meaning relatives had insisted that David needed to express his feelings about losing his mother. But their attempts to make him discuss his grief had only increased his anxiety. It wasn't until Ben stopped pushing for verbal processing and started meeting David where he was that real healing began. "Mrs. Chun," Ben said, "what if we tried something different? What if, instead of focusing on what happened, we focused on what's happening right now? What if we gave Lily some tools to feel safe in the present moment?" He moved slowly to the bubble station, his movements deliberate and calm. "David, can you help me with the special mixture? The one that makes really strong bubbles." As they prepared the solution, Ben began talking, not to Lily directly, but to David, in a voice loud enough for others to hear. "You know what I love about bubbles, David? They're proof that fragile things can still be strong. Look at this. It's just soap and water and air, but when they come together in just the right way, they create something that can float and dance and catch the light." David caught on immediately. "And even when they pop, nothing bad happens. The soap just goes back to being soap." Ben created a small bubble and let it float toward Lily. She tracked its movement with her eyes, and he saw the first hint of curiosity break through her fear. "Lily," he said gently, "bubbles are kind of like feelings. Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small. Sometimes they last a long time, sometimes they pop quickly, but they're always safe to look at." For the next 30 minutes, Ben and David created a gentle show of bubbles while Mrs. Chun and Lily watched. Ben didn't ask Lily any questions, didn't try to engage her directly. He simply created beauty in her presence and narrated what he was doing in calm, soothing tones. Near the end of the session, something magical happened. A small bubble floated directly toward Lily and landed on her nose. Instead of popping, it clung there, a perfect sphere that turned her face into a funny, wonderful sight. Lily's eyes crossed as she tried to look at the bubble, and despite herself, she smiled. It was the first smile Mrs. Chun had seen in 3 months. As they were preparing to leave, Mrs. Chun pulled Ben aside. "She's been having nightmares every night since the fire. Waking up screaming, convinced she can smell smoke. Last night was the first time she slept through the night." "The bubbles helped her sleep?" "No," Mrs. Chun said, tears streaming down her face. "Hope helped her sleep. For the first time in months, I could tell her about something good that would happen tomorrow. I could promise her we'd come back and see the bubble man." That evening, Ben sat in his new apartment, a spacious 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood with good schools, and thought about Lily's smile. They'd moved just 2 weeks ago, and David was thriving in his new environment. He'd made friends with kids in the building, was excelling in his new school, and had even started helping with younger children in the program. But it was moments like today that reminded Ben why all the changes had been worth it. Not just the better salary or the health insurance or the professional recognition, but the chance to be part of something larger than survival. His phone buzzed with a text from Margot. Saw the preliminary evaluation results. 93% of families report significant improvement in their children's emotional regulation. You're changing lives, Ben. He set the phone aside and walked to David's room, where his son was reading before bed. Good day today, buddy. David looked up from his book. The best. Did you see how Lily smiled when that bubble landed on her nose? I did. What did you think about that? I think, David said seriously, that smiles are like bubbles too. They're temporary, but while they're happening, they make everything more beautiful. Ben kissed his son's forehead and turned off the light, marveling at the wisdom that came from a child who'd learned early that broken things could still be whole, that different didn't mean less than, that healing happened in moments so small they were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. As he prepared for bed, Ben thought about Sarah and how proud she would be of what their family had become. They'd taken their pain and transformed it into purpose, their struggle into service. Tomorrow, Lily would return, and Marcus, and Sophia, and all the other children who needed to remember that the world could still be safe and beautiful and full of temporary magic. But tonight, Ben fell asleep thinking about bubbles floating in sunlight, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of families learning to heal. Hashtag Scene 6, the full circle. 1 year later, Ben stood in the lobby of Meridian Media Tower, the same marble-floored space where everything had begun. But today, it looked completely different. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, displaying artwork created by children in the Family Wellness Innovation Program. Tables were set up throughout the space, showcasing different activities: bubble science, art therapy, music corners, sensory play areas. Families moved through the exhibits, children laughing and parents sharing stories of healing and hope. It was the program's first annual celebration, and the turnout had exceeded everyone's expectations. Ben, Mrs. Henderson called out, making her way through the crowd with Marcus in tow. Look what Marcus wanted to show you. Marcus, now 9 and noticeably more confident, held up a science fair trophy. I won first place at school for my project on surface tension. I explained how bubble solution works and why glycerin makes bubbles stronger. That's incredible, Marcus, Ben said, crouching down to examine the trophy. Dr. Rodriguez is going to be so proud. Have you shown her yet? She's my next stop. But I wanted to thank you first. Before I came here, I thought science was just another thing I was bad at. Now I know I'm actually pretty good at understanding how things work. As Marcus ran off to find Dr. Rodriguez, Ben felt a familiar warmth in his chest. These moments, watching children rediscover their own capabilities, seeing families heal, never got old. Mr. Ben. Mr. Ben. Lily Chun came running across the lobby, her mother following behind with a camera. At 6 now, Lily was a completely different child from the silent, terrified little girl who'd first entered their program. Lily, how are you, sweetheart? I'm great. Look what I made. She held up a painting, a bright, colorful house with flowers in the yard and bubbles floating all around it. It's our new apartment. Mama says we can paint my room any color I want. Mrs. Chun reached them, beaming. We finally got approved for a permanent housing placement. 2 bedrooms, ground floor, with a little garden where Lily can play outside. That's wonderful news, Ben said, and meant it. The Chun family's journey had been particularly challenging, not just the trauma of the fire, but the months of temporary housing, the struggle with insurance companies, the financial stress that often accompanied disaster recovery. But the best part, Lily continued, tugging on Ben's sleeve, is that Mama says I can have a bubble machine in the garden. For when I need to remember that beautiful things can happen even after scary things. Ben felt tears threaten. That sounds perfect, Lily. Will you come visit? When we get settled? If your mama says it's okay, I'd love to see your new room. As the Chun family moved on to other exhibits, Ben spotted Evie across the lobby. Now 8, she was confidently leading a group of younger children through a bubble-making demonstration, her voice clear and strong as she explained the process. The secret, he heard her say, echoing words she'd learned from David a year ago, is patience. You can't rush the big bubbles. They need time to grow strong. Margot appeared at Ben's side, following his gaze. Hard to believe that's the same little girl who couldn't speak in public a year ago. She was always that confident, Ben said. She just needed to remember it. Like someone else I know, Margot said meaningfully. Ben looked at her questioningly. You, Ben. A year ago, you couldn't imagine yourself as anything other than a janitor who happened to be good with kids. Now look around. She gestured to the bustling lobby. You've created something that's helping hundreds of families. We've got a waiting list 6 months long, requests from other cities to replicate the program, and a documentary crew coming next month to film our work. Ben surveyed the scene, families laughing together, children playing without fear, parents sharing resources and support. In the corner, David was teaching a group of teenagers how to make bubble solution, his patient explanations helping older kids connect with their inner scientists. It doesn't feel like I created this, Ben said honestly. It feels like it created itself, and I just helped it along. That's exactly what good leadership looks like, Margot replied. And speaking of which, I have something to tell you. The board approved funding for expansion. We're opening 3 more centers this year, one in Brooklyn, one in Chicago, one in Los Angeles. Each one will need a director. Ben felt a mixture of excitement and overwhelm. That's amazing, Margot. But I can't run 4 programs simultaneously. I know. That's why we need to start training other people to do what you do. People who understand that healing doesn't always look like therapy, that trauma-informed care means meeting families where they are, not where we think they should be. Before Ben could respond, he was interrupted by a commotion near the bubble station. A little boy, maybe 4 years old, had knocked over a container of bubble solution and was now crying inconsolably while his father tried to calm him. Ben recognized the signs immediately: the child's disproportionate reaction to a minor accident, the father's frustrated attempts to reason with someone too overwhelmed to listen, the way other families were starting to stare. Without hesitation, Ben walked over and knelt beside the crying child. Hey there, he said softly. I'm Ben. Looks like we had a little bubble solution accident. The boy nodded through his tears, hiccuping. You know what? I've been making bubbles for a long time, and I spill the solution at least once a week. Want to know why? The boy looked up, curious despite his distress. Because sometimes our hands get excited about making bubbles before our brains remember to be careful. And that's okay. We can always make more solution. Ben reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bottle. He'd learned to carry backup supplies everywhere. Should we make some new solution together? I could use an assistant. 20 minutes later, the little boy was happily creating bubbles alongside his father, who kept thanking Ben with obvious relief. How do you do that? The father asked as they watched his son demonstrate proper wand technique to another child. I've been trying to help him with emotional regulation for months, but one spilled container and I'm ready to leave the party. You don't give yourself enough credit, Ben said. You brought him here. You stayed calm when he got upset. You let him work through it. That's exactly what good parenting looks like. As the afternoon continued, Ben moved through the lobby like a gentle conductor, orchestrating moments of connection and healing. He helped a shy teenager find common ground with other kids through their shared interest in bubble physics. He showed an overwhelmed mother how to create a portable calm-down kit using bubble solution and a travel wand. He listened as a grandmother described her grandson's progress since joining their support group for children of incarcerated parents. Each interaction reminded him of why this work mattered, why they'd built something that went beyond traditional therapy models to meet families in the spaces between crisis and healing. As the celebration wound down, Ben found himself back in the spot where it all began, the place where he'd first sat with Evie, creating temporary magic with soap and water and hope. David joined him, carrying a box of leftover supplies. Good day, his son asked. The best, Ben replied. How about you? I saw you teaching the teenagers about bubble chemistry. They thought it was going to be baby stuff at first, David said with a grin. But then I showed them how to calculate optimal glycerin ratios and explain the molecular science behind surface tension. Turns out teenagers like feeling smart just as much as little kids do. Ben laughed. You're going to make an incredible teacher someday. You know that? Maybe. Or maybe I'll work with you in the program. Help other kids who think differently remember that different isn't broken. As they prepared to leave, Margot approached with Evie, both of them carrying small gift bags. We have something for you. Evie announced. A thank you present. She handed Ben a wrapped package that turned out to be a photo album. The first page showed a picture from that first day in the lobby, Ben sitting on the floor with Evie, bubbles floating around them. But as he flipped through the pages, he saw the story of the past year unfold. Children laughing during group sessions, families hugging after breakthroughs, art projects and bubble experiments, and quiet moments of connection. The final page contained a letter in Evie's careful handwriting. Dear Mr. Ben, thank you for teaching me that bubbles are brave. Before I met you, I thought broken things couldn't be beautiful. Now I know that sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that learned how to be strong after they got scared. You helped me remember my voice. Now I want to help other kids remember theirs. Love, Evie. P.S. David says hi and that he's proud to be your son. I'm proud to be your friend. Ben felt tears streaming down his face as he read. When he looked up, he saw that both Margot and Evie were crying too. There's one more thing, Margot said, pulling out an envelope. The board wanted me to give you this. Inside was a formal letter offering Ben the position of Chief Director of Family Wellness Innovation, with oversight of all the new centers they were planning to open. It comes with a significant salary increase, Margot explained, full benefits for you and David, and a budget to hire the team you'll need. But more importantly, it comes with the autonomy to shape this program however you think it needs to develop. Ben looked around the lobby one more time, at the families still lingering, reluctant to leave, at the artwork on the walls created by children who'd rediscovered their creativity, at David patiently helping a custodial worker clean up spilled bubble solution while explaining the chemistry behind the cleaning process. A year ago, he'd been invisible in this space, just another service worker keeping the corporate machine running smoothly. Now he was being offered the chance to lead something that could change how society thought about trauma, healing, and resilience. I accept, he said quietly, but only if David can be officially part of the team, as a peer mentor and program consultant. I was hoping you'd say that, Margot replied. We're also offering him a summer internship position, with pay. As they left the building that evening, Ben carrying his trophy box of memories and David chattering excitedly about his new job title, Ben thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had started with loss, Sarah's death, the end of his teaching career, the daily struggle to keep their small family afloat. But it had transformed into something he couldn't have imagined, a purpose that honored their pain while creating hope for others. Dad, David said as they walked to their car, do you think Mom can see what we're doing? Ben considered the question, looking up at the evening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. You know what I think, buddy? I think your mom is in every bubble we've ever made. Every time we help a scared kid remember how to smile, every time we show a family that healing is possible, every time we create something beautiful out of something broken, she's right there with us. David nodded seriously. I like that. It means she's still helping kids, just in a different way. As they drove home through the city streets, Ben reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. He was still a single father trying to do right by his son. He was still someone who believed that small acts of kindness could change the world. He was still a man who understood that broken didn't mean worthless, that different didn't mean less than, that healing happened in moments so brief they could be missed if you weren't paying attention. But now he had something he hadn't had before, a platform, resources, and a team of people who shared his vision of what trauma-informed care could look like when it was built on understanding rather than protocol, on presence rather than pressure, on the radical idea that sometimes the most powerful healing tools were the simplest ones. Tonight, hundreds of children would go to sleep carrying with them the memory of bubbles dancing in sunlight, of adults who'd sat with them in their fear without trying to fix them, of moments when the world had felt safe and beautiful and full of possibility. And tomorrow, Ben would return to work, not as a janitor pushing a mop through corporate hallways, but as a director building bridges between trauma and healing, between despair and hope, between the children they'd been and the people they were becoming. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of temporary magic that could last a lifetime. The kind of magic that reminded everyone it touched that even the most fragile things could be strong, that even the most broken things could be beautiful, and that sometimes the most important revolutions began with something as simple as soap, water, and the courage to create wonder in the midst of pain. As they pulled into their driveway, Ben caught sight of their reflection in the car's side mirror, a father and son, changed by loss but not defeated by it, carrying forward the memory of a woman who'd believed in the power of small kindnesses to change the world. And in that reflection, he could swear he saw Sarah smiling. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.